Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Carl from Planet 40k, and today we're going to be continuing on from part 1, discussing the new 9th edition core rule changes that have been released by Games Workshop. So in the first video we spoke about changes to the rules in the pre-game and then went on to the game setup. Finally we touched on the new command phase. Today we're going to be talking specifically about the changes for the movement phase and the psychic phase. Before we get started though, just wanted to mention we are a new channel and we could use the subs to help us grow, so please click on that subscribe button below, and if you do like the video, give us a thumbs up. Anyway, enough of that channel advertisement, let's get jumping in. There's a few slight changes to the movement phase. Firstly, the wording has changed. Units can either make a movement or an advance move, they can remain stationary or fall back. The remain stationary part has now been added to clear up rule disagreements, as now you're declaring that a unit is remaining stationary. If a unit does remain stationary, none of the models can be moved for the rest of the phase. Any units from your army that were on the battlefield that were not selected to move are considered remaining stationary. So this clearly explains that if a unit was not on the battlefield that turn, they did not remain stationary. Another slight change in the rulebook to the movement phase is the new term engagement range. It's pretty much the same as the 8th edition rule where you're within an inch of an enemy model. That's now considered engagement range, although there's a slight change to it, which is it's not just 1 inch horizontally, it's also 5 inches vertically. Just worth noting though that you cannot enter engagement range of a model in the movement phase unless you've got the fly keyword. However, you cannot end your movement within that engagement range. So it's sort of the same as the 8th edition, except you've got that 5 inches vertically, which that's going to really help those monster units when you're, previously you couldn't charge things that were up in the ruins, even though the head of the monster was looking straight at, say, a tactical squad, yet the rules kind of said you couldn't fight them, but now you can, so they've definitely tidied that part up. It also means for your infantry squads that are charging up into terrain features like ruins, they don't have to now charge the vertical height as well as the horizontal, so they're going to have a shorter range to be charging, which is much better for them. And those units that are sort of hidden away are now going to be more vulnerable. So you've got a lot of units that tend to hide in the ruins, are just shooting away at everything, and they are now going to be a lot more vulnerable. Okay, moving on to falling back. That's slightly changed as well. You cannot shoot after falling back unless your unit datasheet allows it, or unless the unit has the Titanic keyword. Units with the fly keyword that fell back now can't shoot either, which is a huge nerf, as there are a lot of units and characters that were previously falling back and shooting. Let's not forget about vehicles. They can shoot in combat, which we'll discuss in the shooting phase later on, but if they fall back, they cannot shoot either. So falling back now is really going to sting, and so it should. Although in my opinion, they could have added something similar to Overwatch, except the unit falling back could have tried to shoot while fleeing, maybe hitting on 6s, although I suppose they're trying to remove that feature, so maybe not. Another slight change though, you cannot cast a psychic power with your Psyker if they fell back, unless they are Titanic. So this is going to really hurt those Elder players and them Thousand Suns players, and Magnus does not have the Titanic keyword. So wrapping up the falling back section, you can still use stratagems and relics that allow you to fall back and shoot, but obviously this costs you either CP or your army's relic on that particular unit. Units, however, that have that built into their datasheets have become a lot more overpowered. And this also makes those combat-orientated armies such as Orcs and Tyrannies so much more powerful, as previously they'd be charging across the battlefield, getting into combat, and your opponents would just simply fall back and then shoot the hell out of you. So it's going to be a huge buff to those armies, and Elder are probably going to hate this. Okay, so another change to the movement phase is unit coherency. It looks like a subtle change at first, but if you look at it properly, it's quite a big change. So in the 8th edition, you could be within 2 inches of friendly models within that unit. Now it's still 2 inches, but if you've got more than 6 models, you now need to be within 2 inches of 2 friendly models, not just 1, and it has to be from the same unit. It can be 2 inches across or 5 inches vertically. What they've done is they're trying to stop conga lining, or daisy chaining as they call it, where you're spreading a huge unit of say 30 cultists across the board, covering multiple objectives, Now, you can only hold one objective at a time, but if you're screening off all the other ones from your enemy to get them, it just makes it so much harder for your enemy to get objectives. It also assisted with being in range of aura buffs from your characters or being in range from psychic abilities, but it just didn't look right when you just had a big massive daisy chain going from one end of the board to the other. So they're clearing that out, and it should be gone because it didn't really make sense. It was a very gamey, so I'm glad to see that going. The only problem though is unit coherency checks are now going to be a thing. So even though this happens in the morale phase, it needs to be considered in all phases. A unit coherency test is where if something isn't in coherency in the morale phase, then you just simply remove that model. And if you're removing one model, it could have a domino effect on another model because that person may now not be in the coherency as well. So you keep going until everything's in coherency or you're left with 5 models, and that could be devastating. So you can't daisy chain your squad across. You've got to lump them all together. You've got to put them in a couple of rows to make them, if you take one from a corner, it's not going to affect it because you're still going to be in coherency with 2 others. Worth noting that you can't move out of coherency in the movement phase, but obviously in other phases where you take casualties, such as the psychic phase or the fight phase, there's all sorts of other phases, the charge phases, you could take casualties and you could end up being out of coherency. So you need to be pulling models away wisely when you do it, because let's say you charge into combat, you still need to be in that coherency. So if you're removing a certain model and you want to avoid, say, moving your power fist, it could take away a few other models' coherency. So you've got to plan a little bit better now. One last update on the movement phase is disembarking from transports. So now when you're disembarking, all your units must wholly be within 3 inches of the transport. Whereas previously in the 8th edition, it was just within 3 inches. So every single part of the base must now be within that 3 inches. And if you can't disembark, then your models are going to be removed, or you're staying in there, obviously. So it's going to be a lot tighter for, say, if you're getting out a bigger squad, a squad of, say, 10 Marines, and if you've not got the room for it, you're going to need to make the room for it. Otherwise, they're not getting out. Okay, moving on to the psychic phase. Not much has changed from the psychic phase. Well, not for me anyway. So you can only use 1 psychic ability per phase, which that was already a thing, but that has now become a thing for narrative play as well as match play. Obviously, Smite is still the same, where you can cast it multiple times, but you just add 1 to the warp charge. But these rules go into effect with narrative play as well now. The other thing is Psychers must complete all their psychic abilities before moving on to another Psyker. This might have been standard for some players. It was for me. I was doing it that way. But some players like to jump back and forth between Psychers to see what abilities they casted before making decisions on what else to cast. It's not a huge change. It won't make a massive difference, but I've always played it that way anyway. So it's just going to be less confusing if you stick to 1 Psyker, finish all their abilities, and then move on to the next one. Okay, so to summarize the changes in these 2 phases, the new unit coherency rule is going to take some time getting used to, as you can't just spread your units as thin as possible now to cover as much of the board as you can. It's going to open up a lot more spaces for those strategic reserves and other deep strike units. I like this change a lot. I shouldn't really as a Tyranid player, but I can give you an example of why this change is good. I remember a game I had with Eugenio from Planet 40k where he brought out his Space Wolves, and I knew he had a lot of outflank on his list. So I basically got a couple of squads of Termagants and threw 1 squad down the left flank and 1 squad down the right flank, blocking off the table edge, knowing that he couldn't get on the board with all his outflank units. It was a game mechanic I sort of abused, and after I'd won the game, it felt kind of cheap, and I was asking myself, was that really fun? The answer was no, obviously. So you've got to wonder what's more important, the enjoyment of the game or just being overly competitive when it was just a friendly game. So I'm quite happy that GW have taken this away, and it's made the game feel a bit more realistic anyway. So moving on, the engagement range now being 5 inches vertically as well as the 1 inch horizontally is a great addition. Too many times I've seen small squads of campers in high terrain pieces where things like my Carnifexes are just staring at them dead in the eye but can't get into combat because they're monsters and can't go up ruin levels. I'm going to be making the most of this from now on, but that also means I'm going to have to be hiding my hive guard a little bit, I think. The nerf to the shooting and after falling back is an absolute treat to me. Too often I was getting penalised for just getting into combat with my Tyranids. And then as a Tyranid player, if you get into combat, they've done their job. But when you've got units that just say bye-bye and then they leave and shoot you anyway, it just felt awful as the game went on. So I'm glad that's gone. And finally, that unit coherency check is going to be devastating. I can see a lot of people going with squads of 5s and 6s just to nullify the change. As soon as you lose a model, then you've instantly gone down to the 5 model threshold, so you won't be getting affected by it. So you don't need to be within 2 inches of 2 models. Just be aware that you can't simply just daisy chain anymore. You might think you can, but as soon as you start pulling models, that domino effect is gonna sting. So you're best just lumping them all together in a couple of rows. Otherwise, it's gonna hurt if you don't. So please remember to subscribe. The next video in the series, it should be part 3 of 3, where we're going to be discussing the shooting phase, the charge phase, the fight phase, and the morale phase. So there's quite a lot to get our teeth into. If you've enjoyed this particular video, drop us a thumbs up and hope to see you again soon.